Welcome to the Commerce Lab, where every week we sit down with top-performing consumer brands and leaders to understand what drives their success. How did they hit their first million, their first 20 million, their first 100 million? What strategies are working for them today that you should be testing, and what's not working that you should be avoiding? This isn't just a podcast, it's the business school for brand operators. Hey crew, welcome back to another episode of the Commerce Lab. My name is Alan Burt, and I am pumped for the interview that we just recorded today. I got to sit down with a guy by the name of Joe Crosby, who heads up content media strategy at REI. And REI is one of my favorite retailers. They've been around since 1938, and they sell, frankly, they're the largest outdoor gear and apparel retailer in the U.S., selling everything from camp goods, camp supplies, camp equipment to bikes and kayaks and ski gear. Essentially, anything you need to get into the outdoors, REI is going to sell it. And in an era where third-party sellers and brick-and-mortar retailers in the U.S. are not doing well, REI still seems to be thriving. And one of the reasons why they're thriving is because of their content. They are probably one of the most prolific content creators in the e-commerce or in the retail space right now. And I wanted to bring Joe on to talk specifically about what they do and how they do it. Joe heads up content media strategy at REI. And some of the things we talked about today are, how do they produce it? How do they determine what they produce, right? And how do they know it's going to work? What are their success metrics? Who drives those success metrics? How do they consistently come up with content that is going to be sticky, including the origin stories of one of their most popular podcasts, the Camp Monsters podcast, we should absolutely listen to just to hear the origin story behind. Why did they launch a print publication? In the last year, REI has done everything from short form films, they've got blogs, they've got forums, they've got multiple podcasts, and this last fall, they launched an actual print publication, a magazine that's available in their stores as well as shipped out to co-op members. So why did they go that route? Why did they launch a print publication? Joe breaks it all down. And then most importantly, I asked Joe at the end of the show today, if he were to leave REI and go work for a smaller brand, and he was tasked with actually building a content arm for a smaller brand, say a $5 to $10 to $20 million brand, how would he do it? What would be his frameworks? What would be the strategy he followed, and what mediums would he publish on, and how would he scale it? And for any of you out there that are growing a brand or the owner of a brand, whether you do content marketing now or you actually want to start your own content marketing or content media arm, you'll find this piece incredibly fascinating to understand the frameworks that Joe would use. So without further ado, I'll let Joe break it down in this episode about REI. Hey, Joe, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Alan.
So before we dive into the nitty gritty, and I've been really looking forward to this interview because I'm a massive REI fan and longtime customer. But before we dive into sort of the nitty gritty questions, if you don't mind giving everybody just a very quick, 30-second intro about who you are and what you do.
Yeah. So Joe Crosby, I manage the content and media team at REI Co-op. REI Co-op is the nation's largest outdoor retailer. A lot of people have heard of us, plenty have not, and that's okay. We sell, outdoor gear and apparel to facilitate, a life outside. And that's everything from a good puffy jacket, taking your dog on a walk, to mountaineering gear for summiting the highest peaks. So, it's a pretty good place to work. My role entails what was actually the content marketing program. We've kind of evolved and repositioned it from there based on the types of content we produce, which is my primary purview, our film and video program, our podcast network, and our editorial publishing on the Co-op Journal and our print magazine, Uncommon Path, which we launched last year.
And so I want to dig into all this very specifically to kind of understand what you guys do, sort of the breadth of what you guys do from a content standpoint, because you do a ton. But I think just to give everybody some quick background on REI, if you're not familiar with REI, and Joe, I don't know if you actually know the answer to this, but how long has REI been around? Do you know approximately when it was started?
I do know this. I think you're required to know this. Not really required. It doesn't go on a performance review or anything, right. but I think after a month, we were founded in 1938. And
38, right?
Yep. as the story goes, Lloyd and Mary Anderson, our founders, started in the Seattle area. If you've frequented our stores, you might have seen the Ice Axe door handle on the stores. That is because that is the first piece of gear that their community came together to find. What they wanted is they needed equipment to climb mountains. They couldn't find anything locally, and needed to actually source the equipment from Europe. And so it was a group of, I believe, 23 folks who sort of came together to, I guess, crowdsource and share this, procurement of equipment. And then that turned into what is the co-op now.
Yeah, and it's interesting. You guys have maintained this co-op for all those years. I'm a member of the co-op. It's funny. My dad was a member of the co-op, and I remember going in as a kid, and actually it was more as like a teenager. And he was buying something, and they were looking at his co-op number, and the girl that was checking him out was like, "I've never seen a number this small before." Like, he's been a co-op member for so long that he has one of those incredibly short co-op numbers. But I think I don't know how many other businesses in the US operate in this fashion, but you guys have been operating that way since the beginning, which is fascinating. And the other thing that's fascinating, and the reason why I wanted to have you on the show, is that you guys are a third-party retailer, right? You sell lots of brands, lots of different products. You have your own line of product. There are REI branded products, but a lot of what you sell is, from other brands. And I think what we've seen, especially recently in the last, call it 5 years, is that these sort of third-party retailers are having a lot of trouble, right? And especially physical retail, large retail locations, mall locations, these types of brands are really struggling, whereas you guys seem to be thriving. And I think it's an interesting case study to look into why. And I think part of that is just sort of the authenticity of the brand you guys have built. And a big component of that is content. And that's specifically why you're here today, because I want to talk about REI's content strategy and how you guys do this, what you guys do, break it all down. And so I think before we get into sort of the actual strategy, I think to give everybody some breadth of how much you guys do, let's sort of break it down, right? You guys have a print publication that you launched this year called Uncommon Path, right? And that's a physical print magazine that you sell at stores, you deliver to select customers. You guys do blogs, you guys do podcasts, you guys do short and long form films. What else do you guys do?
Yeah, that's that pretty much sums it up. I would say, and taking a step back, I think the reason that the co-op has thrived, and this is going to be a segue into how the content program actually started back in 1997, actually, but is that we are more than just a retailer, and one of the things we say internally is that we're a different kind of company, and that's not just a brand talking point. We actually are. Part of it is that we're a co-op, we're member owned, and to date, I don't know where we are, 18 million members or so, but that includes expertise around the gear. This is gear that in some cases can be life or death, kind of decisions, and so we provide education in the stores, we provide classes around that, we provide experiences to get people on trips. And back in 1997, which is really remarkable if you think about what content marketing became, and this is 1997, a decade before anyone was talking about it, REI launched the Expert Advice Library, which is skills and gear sort of education library of content. It's actually the largest outdoor education library of content on the internet. And it's everything from like checklists, things you need to go outside, how to select the right trail running shoe, how to set up a tent, how to start a fire. And so that sort of service is the foundation of the co-op. It also served as the sort of the foundation of the content program. Starting about, I guess it was maybe 5 years ago or so, we had, like many companies, a sort of rudimentary blog that had a couple of corporate communications posts, maybe the occasional sort of outdoor lifestyle thing, but it really wasn't formalized. It was kind of one-off. There wasn't a huge strategy to it. We really, starting about 5 years ago, really revamped that, redesigned it, and built this layer of editorial on top of this expert advice education library, which has gradually expanded to what it is now, where, we are providing, from an editorial perspective, the full service of education, information, and inspiration around a life outside. So from an audience perspective, that means I need to know what gear I need for the trip coming up. We provide that. I want to hear stories about people doing cool things in the outdoors. We provide that. We also, from a business perspective, use it to reinforce some of the things that are still very much core to outdoors, but not specific to activity. And that is things around, public policy, things related to federal land management, public lands, our impact agenda overall, which, strives to build diversity, equity, and inclusion in the outdoors, access to communities that haven't traditionally had access to the outdoors. So as we're creating editorial that reinforces that, it's less about us articulating REI's brand position in that sense, and it's more about telling the stories or reporting on the news that speak to those matters. And I'm talking right now mostly about our digital publication, Co-op Journal, but we do that in a variety of ways too. Over the last few years, we've done 45 short docs that capture some of these stories intended to inspire life outdoors, showing the gamut of people who are participating in the outdoors, that they're, by and large, these are not extreme athletes. It's everyday people doing everyday things outside. And then in 2018, we launched our first podcast that grew to, we have 4 podcasts online currently. We're going to launch a few more this year, which is, a similar part of the similar sort of strategy and ethos, which is to engage people with stories of life outside. And to do so, part of the diversity of the content we offer is to engage people in the diverse ways in which they consume content. Some people prefer reading long form articles. Some people prefer watching videos. Some people prefer listening to podcasts. Some people do all of the above. And then that leads to Uncommon Path, the magazine we launched last year in September. Our second issue is January. We'll have another issue coming out in April, which was interesting because we had all of this editorial production that we were creating, which really became, among the largest, publishers of outdoor media in the industry,
right.
Never mind from a commerce company. And what we really saw was we'd had traditionally, a number of catalogs. You probably received them. We had full price catalog that we had sent out every year. And I think our direct mail team and us were just thinking of what's a different way we could package this rather than delivering, a seasonal product to people, absent context or maybe value. What's a way that we can engage them differently and in a different format? And that led to the magazine, which is, and if you open up the magazine, if you receive it, you'll see that, and you'll see all of the things I stated about the types of content we create, and the parts of our business that we articulate through that. And that, yes, there's an equipment section, which is pretty robust and includes gear guides, gear reviews, stories of, people in the gear and apparel industry are doing interesting things. We also have a feature well that captures, stories about different outdoor lifestyles, stories about climate and environment. And then we have all of the small sort of bite-size, front of book elements that people would want that are sometimes, kind of heavy or earnest or serious in nature, also sometimes light and fun and just entertaining. And so the magazine as an evolution of a full price catalog really becomes a manifestation of the total brand. And I think is, in that way, a pretty solid representation of our overall content program, but also what what REI is trying to do.
So first off, there's a ton in this that I want to sort of deconstruct with you. But the very first one is because I've obviously taken a look at the magazine, and I think the range of content that you guys produce is pretty incredible, right? It's everything from expert level sort of deep guides and gear reviews, all the way to what feel almost like, I don't want to call them fluff pieces because they're not fluff, but a little more almost like pop culture pieces, right? Like I saw you guys did a piece that was an interview or a sort of a Q&A with Christina Tosi, who is the founder of Milk Bar Momofuku in New York, right? By no means would you look at Christina Tosi, who funny enough is my wife's old boss, and say, right, isn't that funny? No way you look at Christina Tosi and say, man, she is sort of an iconic outdoor person that you would associate with REI, right? So what I guess my question is when you guys think about content creation, what is the framework you're using to decide what content to produce? Because you have such what seems to be a fairly wide spectrum of content.
Well, I would say there are a couple of things. I mean, obviously we're a business, so we look at, our different, sort of different divisions within our business, which would include, retail, our RA ventures, and which are our guided trips that are domestic and international. Also our classes, in store, which can be everything from learning how to belay if you're an aspiring climber, to how to ride a bike, to how to take outdoor photography. And then again, our impact agenda that I mentioned, which is, primarily squared around, climate, environment, corporate and product sustainability, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and health and wellness. And so if that's a guiding framework and we say, okay, that's maybe our way into some stories, we look at this above all, sort of mission, which is to facilitate a life outdoors. And a big way of doing that is allowing people to see themselves in the outdoors and recognize really primarily that again, you don't have to be an extreme athlete to do these things. And I think that's traditionally how the outdoor industry, both from a brand and media perspective, was depicted. I mean, we've all seen it, and we participate in that way too. But it's people climbing huge mountains or pointing to Free Solo, Academy Award winner. I mean, that is an exceptional feat that one person has done. That's not actually how most people are participating. So, featuring Christina Tosi, that's not to say everybody's going to create a sweets empire. And we don't say they see themselves in that way, but it's to say that there are these other people who participate, and it might even be leading other parts of other aspects of pop culture who also have a connection to the outdoors and an outdoor lifestyle. And interestingly enough, that one was inspired by, her episode on Netflix's Chef's Table, because there's a moment where she's running, and kind of in her thoughts, and we're like,
I've seen it.
We're like, what if she's available? And so that was our inspo for that. But yeah, it's just sort of to reframe what outside means for people, because it means different things for multiple different people. And so we try to kind of capture that range, so people can identify, and we can break down some barriers, maybe make it less intimidating, make people feel a sense of community, knowing that there are other people like them, doing these things. So, yeah.
And how calculated is that? Do you have certain personas that you're trying to hit when you think about content? So as an example, when you launch the next, or when you guys release the next, Uncommon Path edition, is that saying, hey, we have 5 very specific types of personas, or avatars that we are speaking to, and we need content that's going to speak to all 5 types, right? You've got sort of John, the hardcore adventurer, and then you've got, Tim, who is sort of a, urban sort of recreationalist who kind of gets outside maybe once a week, right? Do you have sort of a spectrum of personas that you speak to, or how defined is that process?
Yeah. So, as most companies, at least eventually, do, we have some customer segments and some targets that we look at, and they're pretty broad based. And I would say, that's a factor, but also it's really just about balance, knowing that, there are as many different outdoor experiences as there are, people in the United states just about. Right. And so it really is a balance thing, like, because we're cognizant of that almost intuitively, apart from any of the science and measurement around our customer segments, is that not everybody's hardcore. Also, not everybody is, super casual and, just taking a jog around the block. And so, we try to be cognizant of that balance of the range of perspectives. We do have, some specific business inputs, but I wouldn't say that's maybe a starting point, but it's also not a barrier, because we'll also pursue anything that's a good story, a meaningful story, a helpful story, a fun story. We'll do that, if it makes sense.
And who's the one making the decision about whether or not it makes sense and coming up with those ideas? Is it, is there a, editorial director who's leading the charge and sort of dictating, or is that sort of bubbling up from the ground up, or from the team members that are, doing the actual content production? What's the process for, ideation and choosing ideas and then actually solidifying what's going to go to print or to publish or to film?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I would say chiefly the decisions, my manager, our director of content media at Palomotola, who really started the program when I said the evolution of the blog into sort of full-fledged publication, that was him starting on his own, employee one within this initiative, and now our team has, over a dozen folks working on it. So, he leads the team. I would say, in terms of ideation and decision-making, though, this is where it represents sort of the trust in our leadership and the trust in the working team, meaning, and again, it kind of depends on what it is we're doing. So as you can imagine, we're launching a magazine. That's a pretty big total co-op wide endeavor, in which case, we're getting sign off from Ben Steele, our chief customer officer, who oversees marketing, creative, and our digital divisions, part of Gorbani, who's ultimately our boss, the executive over creative and brand shared services, Vivian Long, the head of marketing. With an individual story, though, that might be, or podcast concept or an individual video, that's coming from the working team. By and large, they have, pretty good autonomy in order to qualify those decisions. Depending on the level or the scale, they might, kind of go up the chain for approval. And certainly with some of our bigger investment projects or marquee projects, there is some level of review at a certain point, but it's pretty dynamic. And I would say that the biggest value of our improvement in quality and volume has to do with, having a really strong, super bright working team who's kind of driving the day to day. And by that, let me be clear, I don't mean me. I mean the people on our team. And so, I think that's sort of the real value. And they also, represent the range of perspectives we're talking about, where, we have somebody who during the summer will just casually go climb Mount Rainier and then ski down because that's his idea of fun, versus someone who's just, up at 5:30 a.m. walking your dogs in the cold, rainy Seattle winter, and so you have these range of perspectives too that help balance it out, like, sort of intuitively as we're, ideating and concepting. So,
So it sounds like the ideation tends to bubble up from the team. And then in terms of what gets actually green lighted is that being done by you, or is that being done at a senior level on the retail side?
No, that's almost, I was going to say that's almost always done by me, maybe Paolo. Again, depending on the size of the investment, sometimes it's a top-down strategy where like Paolo will be putting together, potential partnerships or business relationships that aren't yet tangible. They're just sort of concepts that then the working team will try to execute. Having said that, there are definitely times where we are seeking cross-divisional alignment. The magazine is a perfect example where we were in lockstep with our retail and merchandising partners, because as you can imagine, a full price catalog, which they've been accustomed to, is a pretty significant representation of their part of the business. So they have an interest in that changing. So I'll also say that even though I was mentioning some of the executives more directly involved with our work, it's really a testament to the total organization's buy-in. You have a merch team that's used to 80 years of a full price catalog going on. And we say, we're going to do a magazine. And they're like, that's great. What if we did an article on drinkware? And that's their response. They're already like contributing ideas. So
that's pretty cool.
Yeah, there is cross-divisional alignment depending on the content. I would say, I mentioned our impact agenda. We have our brand stewardship and impact team, which really drives our philanthropy, because we give money to 400 organizations a year through our REI Co-op Foundation. And so, we work with them quite a bit too, on areas of interest as it relates to, our impact agenda and some of the things we're doing on the back end to improve the industry and sort of make change.
And so how do you guys measure success, right? Because you guys are sort of in this interesting position where it sounds like, you and your team in Palo operate very much like a media company, right? You're kind of coming up with media ideas and content ideas that's going to engage the audience, but you're being funded by a massive retail organization, right? Which sounds like does oversee, but doesn't necessarily dictate agenda, right? So how do you guys view success metrics on the content side? How do you guys measure what's working and what's not working, and who's determining what those success metrics are?
That's a great question. So you're exactly right. I mean, we operate and we treat our view more as a media company, and as I mentioned a little bit earlier, what was the content marketing team, we intentionally repositioned as content media team. So to that end, there are some, sort of performance metrics that are more in line with how a media company would measure themselves. And that has to do with, content performance and, engagement across the board, traffic, video views, podcast downloads. At the same time, we still have our roots in a content marketing program. And so as we have this range of content, some of that is more directly associated with, driving demand to the business. And so the way that we measure the program is a hybrid of some of those media performance metrics with, some associated, commerce or transactional metrics. And I'd also say that from that standpoint, as we serve kind of a marketing function apart from media, it's, I said transaction, it's not just that. I mean, it's also as we're measuring against things like brand awareness or even ad efficiency, the different, using different types of content for advertising and seeing how they perform. And in that way, we might have a short doc where the initial objective was engagement with a certain audience. If that same short doc is then used within a brand campaign, its measurement might be different. We might be looking at ad efficiency when that's used in a video placement versus a traditional sort of anthem video or sizzle or something like that. So it kind of depends on the use too. But we do kind of measure all of it. How those are defined, it's really us, our team, making those recommendations to leadership. Oftentimes they're making recommendations to us, about how we focus it. But it's definitely a conversation because this is new. This is relatively new territory, not just for us, I would say, for a lot of folks. And even though you see the trend of a lot of larger brands investing in content and maybe approaching something like Media Perspective, there aren't a whole lot that have the permission to chase after the types of content we do, the volumes that we do. So a lot of it is kind of creating a new hybrid model of measurement, like in real time. So that's actually, as people see the splashy content, the videos, and that's great. But honestly, internally, some of the most fun creative work is figuring out, how we're measuring the stuff and how we're making decisions, from an analytical standpoint.
And so are you guys, so I think would be sort of the interesting follow-up that would be, what content do you find is the most successful for you guys, right? And it sounds like success can be defined in a couple different metrics. One is more traditional media, clicks, downloads, signups. One would be more sort of traditional retail, looking at sort of like, return on ad spend and how well content is sort of consumed in an advertising platform. But for the way that you guys think about producing content going forward, what's been the most successful type of content, for you so far?
Wow. Yeah. I mean, I think they're all different and all successful in their own ways, so I think it's hard to say what's most successful. If we were given, for example, we were going to launch a campaign and, we had other teams come to us and say, we're trying to achieve this objective, then we would recommend certain types of content to help facilitate or support that objective because they would be better for that use. One example would be our campaign that ran last year. There were a number of, it was very much introductory, find yourself in the outdoors. So recommendations there, the most successful content would be inspirational short docs or very basic, fundamental kind of educational content found on the Co-op Journal or expert advice. We might not make those same recommendations for other initiatives. So, I hesitate to say that like one is more successful than the other in aggregate. We view them as an ecosystem, different entry points into our content program, thereby creating different entry points into the business. And I think we would devalue the program overall if we overemphasize one or the other, because we're reducing the number of entry points for an audience.
Yep. And it sounds like the overall success metric is audience growth, right? And whether it's on the advertising side, on the retail side, or on the media side, it's trying to engage people and inspire them to go outside, right? And if you can see engagement metrics, it shows success, right?
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. And I think that's actually something where from even the way we talk about the program is that we talk about, instead of, customer journeys or marketing funnels, that we use that language too. And certainly the business does. But for us, we talk about audience development. Actually, instead of saying the marketing of our content, we say distribution. So there's some terminologies we use intentionally that do come from the media industry, but from an audience development perspective, it's exactly that. It's we're trying to build an audience of advocates for the outdoors. First and foremost, we are not trying to transact all of those people. We're not trying to convert every content consumer to a retail purchaser, and we see value in that because it becomes pretty powerful if you're if we're successful. In doing so, we address what we call our societal KPI of having people spend more time outside. Right now, people on average spend 95% of their time indoors, which sounds insane, but also kind of makes sense when you think like, well, we're going to jobs and we're in an office and we go grocery shopping, we're in a grocery store and we're home, and it just the living our lives almost requires us to be inside. So if we can chip away at that number and even get it to reduced at 94.8% of our time inside on average, that becomes pretty meaningful. And we feel like content is one way in which we can do that successfully. Of course, we also offer the classes I mentioned as another way to help facilitate that. But so we see value in that from an audience building perspective.
Hey crew, just a quick interruption to ask if you like what you are hearing and want more. Perhaps even a weekly digest of what's working today in the world of e-commerce. Every week, our team of strategists compile a single email with growth strategies and operations tactics gleaned from our work with and analysis of today's top performing brands. Think of it as the brand operator's cheat sheet to keep you ahead of the curve and ahead of the competition. Just head over to thecommercelab.com. That's thecommercelab.com to sign up.
Yeah, and from the retail side, while it's maybe not direct as the largest, outdoor gear retailer in the U.S., if you reduce the amount of time people spend inside and they're spending more time outside, it's obviously going to affect the retail business. So I think it's a very cool mission and way of thinking about content. Because I think a lot of brands, especially a lot of brands that we speak to and work with that are a little bit smaller, they're looking for direct ROI all the time. And I think, I know when it comes to audience building and content, you have to have a larger, more long-term perspective that, the content isn't necessarily always going to drive a sale directly, right? And you have to think about, what's this mission you're building? What's the why behind, why people come and buy from you, right? And are you developing this sort of mission in this ecosystem, and ultimately even a community of people that are going to come back and buy eventually? But if you develop that community, they're going to be so much more dedicated to you as a brand if you're the one who's facilitated the build out of that community, right? And so there's so much sort of indirect connection between sort of content and retail that's so hard to manage, or I should say so hard to measure. And that's why I asked. I'm just curious how you guys think about the measurements of success when it comes to content, because it is very gray, especially if you're trying to always tie it back to a sale.
Yeah. Well, and I would also say, like, there's just the adoption of content marketing as an actual term or philosophy, and into branded content and all those things, which we do. We partner with media companies to a smaller extent. We do less of that now because we can create a lot of it, ourselves. But I think it's the figuring out of different ways to engage consumers, because there are traditional marketing tactics have their place. It can't be relied on exclusively. I think you see consumers that are looking for some, values-based alignment with the places that they, spend their money. There are a number of options, a number of places that people can buy whatever product. And so there's some values-based alignment that I think makes sense. That is, and also as a result, I think consumers are just a lot savvier than they ever have been, which is to say they can both acknowledge what is an ad and what isn't an ad, and what is coming from a brand and what is not coming from a brand. And they also, I think, kind of react accordingly. And which is to say, maybe they don't want to be hit over the head with your brand position every time. Or maybe they do. I mean, that's sort of the balance of like the entire marketing engine, like which levers you're pulling at a certain time. But I do think that if you are tying everything to ROAS or any sort of measurement for ROI, I mean, I think that you're probably doing a disservice to the people that you're communicating with, because then you're just treating them as sellable units, and they're not that. They're people who are trying to live their lives and, are buying products that they need or want to support their lifestyle. And so I think it's appropriate to remind ourselves that they are humans, and also to remind ourselves that we are also consumers outside of our jobs, and how do we want to be talked to, and how do we want to be approached, and how do we want to make our decisions, to think outside ourselves a little bit.
And I think something too that gets lost when you're looking sort of through the blinders of sort of direct return on ad spend or ROI is this idea that really, really, and I mean like really, really good content is viral. Right. And if you produce something that is just so incredibly powerful and touching and sort of tugs on emotional strings that connect with that individual person, that person's going to share it. Right. And that is so much more scalable than, how much can we scale up this Facebook ad in January. Right. And so, and I think that's something that's also very difficult to measure. And that sort of leads me into my next question, because this is something I think you guys have done incredibly well, is you guys have launched these initiatives that are, seem almost like to come out of nowhere from, if you were to compare it to other sort of, major retail brands, but things like the Monsters podcast, right? Like that individual component to me is such a cool concept. And I'm going to let you explain it so I don't mess it up. But I'd love to know, how did that concept come to light and actually get produced? Because I think it's a great example of something that's just a really interesting, fun piece of content that got, I think, a ton of viral attention because people just connected with the idea behind it.
Yeah. So that was Camp Monsters is the official name of the podcast. And, I think when we were sort of testing out podcasts beginning of 2018, we knew, again, when I mentioned that people consume content in different ways and we want to create different entry points, podcast was logical, and the growth and audio consumption is undeniable. Also creating space for people who, even if they might watch our videos and watch or read our articles, that you're not doing that during what are defined as monotonous moments. And that might be on a run, although I don't find running monotonous. Some people do. Driving to work, cooking food, which those are the times when people are primarily listening to podcasts. So that creates another opportunity to engage people. Camp Monsters specifically became an evolution of our podcast program. And this is to the point where I say, the relative autonomy and empowerment of our team, where Chelsea Davis, who directly leads our podcast program, actually was inspired by these sort of illustrated Camp Monster avatars, which if you've seen the podcast or the art for the podcast, those were actually part of a years ago marketing campaign, and they're still up on the walls in the hall in the office because they look cool. And she was curious about what the story was behind these things. The Camp Monsters they're cryptids. It's like Bigfoot is an obvious one, but these are all of these other regional ones. The Bat Squatch, the Ozark Howler, the New Jersey Devil. And she was curious about the story behind these. And so the concept, among many that she sort of pitched to us, and this gets to your question about how concepts are reviewed, of the many that she pitched, that was just an obvious one, because it became this format where it was like, well, what if we were telling the story and the history, both real and sort of fictional? And I say real in quote fingers, because obviously these are mythological creatures,
right.
But real reported stories and sort of fictional stories in a campfire format, because that's something that is, that a lot of people have some familiarity with, even if they aren't, quote unquote defined as, an active outdoor participant. The idea of sitting around a fire and telling stories and so that became the manifestation. It was quite literally inspired by some posters in the office. And so, with anything, we're making, some intuitive kind of bets that something is going to be good. And then we build, a marketing and distribution plan around those things to see if they'll perform. And then, in this case, that was successful and has been successful. And I think, as you noticed, it resonated with people. But, it's a point when we're thinking about our ways into content, that being something that is ostensibly about these camp monsters, but fundamentally is about this shared experience that people can, relate to, which is sitting around a fire and listening to somebody tell a story.
And how much of these ideas are sort of inspired by sort of existing customers, or like, you hear the term UGC, user generated content, all the time. I'm just curious, how much of what you guys do you try to incorporate, stories or photography or interaction with actual co-op members? Is there any component of that in sort of how you come up with new ideas?
Yes and no. And that one, we have, numerous, members, partners, philanthropic partners, who, have either pitched stories or just been source material that we've decided to cover because they had interesting stories. So I would say probably less about somebody actually pitching us, hey, I have this 10-minute video. Do you want to support it? But more about it being kind of source material for the stuff that we create, because there are so many interesting people doing interesting things and valuable things that we cover. From a UGC standpoint, stuff that my team is less directly involved in, but you could see if you followed us on our social platforms. We have a bunch of excellent photography UGC provided to us by Outdoor Community on our Instagram. Oftentimes, they're tagging us with Opt Outside, which is, our big sort of fall moment and kind of, de facto tagline. And the power of that is less that it's a direct communication saying, hey, use this photo. It's more that there's this community that is organically and sort of proactively tagging this overarching kind of mission or theme, which is Opt Outside. It's beyond even REI, and it's this sort of recognition of life outdoors. And so that's an interesting way in which people kind of come to us with content. In this case, it's photos, but yeah, it's speaks volumes to the power of community, I think.
So I want to try to kind of take this a step back, and I think this has been a fascinating look at what REI does and how you guys do it. But for the folks listening, I want to try to bring this home a little bit and try to see if you kind of put yourself in the shoes of maybe a brand that was a little bit smaller, right? So let's say you left REI, you joined a brand that was doing $5 million in revenue, $10 million in revenue. It could be in the outdoor space. It couldn't be. It doesn't matter. And you were tasked with growing an audience for that brand, right? An authentic audience that doesn't have to be directly tied to an ROI or to ads. You're not going to be just scaling up ads. But if you were going to go out and build a content program for a smaller brand, where would you start? What would be sort of the first thing you would do? Is there a specific channel or a specific approach, or kind of talk me through? And I know this is sort of putting you on the spot, but I'm just very curious, given your experience. How would you approach that type of a challenge in that type of a smaller brand environment?
Service and education is where I would start. And, a lot of people, that usually is tied to an SEO, an organic search strategy, going off measurable expressed intent, meaning you can see a volume of demand or search queries around a certain topic that's maybe related to your business, and that people are looking for information around that. But even whether you're using organic search as a starting point or not, service and education is the primary value you can offer to someone, because it's somebody who has a need that is fulfilled. And that's the difference between needs and wants and education and inspiration, And so if if you are making a widget, then it behooves you to educate potential consumer base, not just about the widget that you make, but about the industry or the context in which that resides, and thereby offering the information you need, presenting yourself as an authority and an expert on that subject, and building some credibility within that apart from the product. So, I'm using widget as, a made up thing, but I hesitate to even provide a specific example, but I would say, TVs or something.
Sure.
Somebody's looking for TV, and you're educating people on different types of TVs, technology around TVs, whatever. Not to say that's a $5 million business is a TV startup, but yeah, I think education and service is absolutely the foundation where you would start.
So I get the education part. What do you mean by service specifically?
Yeah, it's kind of synonymous with education a little bit. But I think the distinction would be if education is oftentimes a sort of sequential kind of step-by-step kind of thing, like this is the stuff you need to know. Service might be the information or context around the education that creates around the explicit education that creates a more fully formed view of a topic. And I would say, that might be like, let's say you're filing your taxes. Education might be the step-by-step for actually collecting your W-2s and whatever, and figuring out how to file that. The added service might be explaining why you even get a W-2, the other types of tax forms you might get, some of the deductions you can consider, stuff like that,
And do you have any particular sort of, mediums or channels that you think you would start with, right? If you had, if you're working on a budget, much smaller budget than what you guys have now, what do you think would be the medium that you would be most heavily sort of leaning towards? Are you talking about sort of written content and blogs and storytelling? You talking about video, podcasts? What would you, and this also could be a bit of personal preference, and I'm curious as to why, but what would you choose as your medium?
Yeah, it really, if you're a small business and don't have a huge budget, the most efficient thing to do to start is certainly written content. And I mentioned the search aspect. It's because it's low cost to create if you are working inside a company to the point of building expertise and credibility. Normally you have subject matter experts in the walls of the building. So it's kind of easy to source that internally at a lower cost. There's built-in demand or interest in that by way of organic search, meaning you don't have to concern yourself as much with putting money behind it to ensure it shows up in front of people, which is oftentimes how, folks are distributing content and advertising, even media companies. So I would say definitely written content. Absolutely. At a certain point though, that while that probably should always be a foundation, it's not enough. And it's not always, or it's not going to do enough, for what you need to do. But to start out, I mean, that's definitely where I would go. And I think a big issue with folks who are chasing video specifically, for example, particularly when they haven't done it before, is it's, not having necessarily a clear sense of your sort of identity within video space, the cost of producing it, and it's just easy to get it wrong and can become a pretty big time suck and financial suck if you're not really clear on the objective of what it is you're doing. And generally, if you get really focused and clear on written content and understanding what your identity is from a content perspective, from a service and education perspective, it starts to create some pretty clear extensions into other formats and other parts of the experience. Where I mentioned inspiration, you start to understand the connection between inspiration and education. And so it becomes easier to launch. But yeah, I think a lot of people see video and think that that's maybe the way to go. And I would caution them to doing that. Although at a certain point I would absolutely encourage them to do it, but probably not to start.
Not to start. And you mentioned sort of once you understand your identity, could you expand upon that just for a minute? What do you mean by your identity?
Well, I mean, to the point of if you are building a library of content, what it is, there are going to be some parameters around what it is you do and don't do. And I was speaking to widgets and TVs and taxes. There's at a certain point, it becomes adjacent to your core business or just non-productive to do what you do. I would say, for us, to use us as an example, a pretty easy disqualifier for the things that are not right for our identity are extreme sports. Those are outdoor, that's outdoor activity. It's not really the kind of thing, it's not part of our identity. And I think as you start to sort of realize the parameters of the service you can offer, the audience you have, you kind of start to understand, the sandbox, so to speak, that you can play with and play within and what you can create. So, yeah,
that's interesting. So to kind of dive a little bit deeper on that. So when you look at sort of the breadth of maybe, outdoor or adventure related content that's being produced, you look at, what's being produced by REI or versus maybe what's being produced by like a Red Bull Media or like a GoPro Media Group or something like that, that has a much more high adrenaline sort of take to it. You guys would sort of look at it and go, that's not congruent with our brand identity.
Yeah. I mean, for the most part, it's distinct audiences, distinct needs. Well, I say distinct audiences within what they're consuming. Obviously, there are a lot of people who like to do each thing, but for our purposes, and there's definitely some overlap. I know, Red Bull Media House, they've definitely, done some things that are certainly within our sort of sphere of interest. They did a film that it was an actually excellent climbing film. It didn't get as much attention because of Free Solo, but called The Dawn Wall, which is about Tommy Caldwell, who's actually featured in Free Solo and a friend of Alex Honnold's. And it was done by Cinder Films, which is a climbing film production company, and Red Bull Media House. So, that's one that would be, very core to the kind of thing that we might do. So there is some overlap, but yeah, generally the skydiving from the upper stratosphere kind of thing is not what we would be after.
Yeah. So what you'd say when the advice to a younger brand would be, first you need to identify, hey, who's the target audience at a very, very deep level, and put some parameters around how you're going to communicate to them. And this is all things that brands should be doing anyway, because this is how you sell product. Yeah. But sort of following that exact same process of identifying what that brand identity is that you want your audience, your customers to perceive you as, and then that sort of is the guiding light for how you then start to create content.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as you are sort of building your brand creative guidelines, and even if you're not formally calling them that, but as you're thinking about like, this is the image that I'm going to use for my business thumbnail on LinkedIn, or this is my logo, you're starting to create the creative guidelines. I think an extension of that, like, audience voice and tone guidelines, which you don't have to be creating even education-based content to see the need for voice and tone guidelines, because you're going to be communicating in some capacity and you want to have a voice, and a distinct voice that people can connect with. And then that is a good starting point for content, certainly.
And do you guys at REI have a very specific voice and tone guideline that everybody follows? Is that how you keep content consistent across, podcast versus film versus print?
We do, although I would say at this point, it's almost, I think everybody sort of inherently kind of understands what it is. So nobody's referencing the document, but,
sure.
But yes, we do have voice and tone guidelines. And what's interesting though, where the growth of content specifically is it does at a certain point require, some additional nuance to how information is being communicated. Overall, we are, REI is, we are an advocate. We are a friend offering helpful advice. We are relatively sincere and earnest. We are absolutely sincere, relatively earnest, and how we are offering information. I would say, as it relates to interesting stories from a content perspective, that can become pretty one note pretty quickly. If you're talking about the 45 short docs I mentioned, or, some of the feature length kind of films that we're getting involved with. So you start to identify some extensions, I would say, of that, and where you have some room to roam based on format. But overall, we are, really cognizant of the connection of anything that we're putting out from a messaging standpoint to ensure that it is aligned with how the overall brand identifies itself. And you could see that with the magazine, even how we select the cover of the magazine, and making sure that it feels like a magazine, but also still feels like an REI print product, as people have recognized it with catalog and everything. So yeah.
That's very cool. Well, Joe, we'll sort of move towards wrapping up, because we're taking up a ton of your time, and we really, really appreciate it. So to kind of move towards wrapping this up, where I'd kind of like to finish is, we talked, this has been incredibly helpful. And I think the advice you've been given for what has been working for you guys and how it works is going to give folks a lot of perspective. Sort of the curveball I throw is what hasn't worked? Like, what have you guys done on the content side and the media side that has just bombed? Has there anything just been like epic failures that you're like, man, we tried it, but it just didn't stick?
Yeah. Well, I guess we've been fortunate in that we've had very few things actually bomb. So it would be, I would say, so overall video, very successful for us. Certainly we've had some video that was a little bit trial and error and didn't work out. Our first podcast, and this has less to do with the value of the content, I think, but us, not knowing what to do in podcasts when you started out, because, listening to podcasts is way different than producing and distributing them, as you well know. But our first podcast is one called Take It From Me. It's this 8-episode podcast that people still listen to, but we haven't really marketed it. We didn't do a good job of marketing it. I think there are things that if we were going to redo it, we would redo the audio. But what's funny about that is it didn't bomb because the value of the content itself. We didn't give it the legs it needed to, because we just kind of didn't know how we should get it out there. And it was also the appropriate size thing to learn from, though, because had we invested in something like Camp Monsters with a, similar a level of ignorance about how to distribute a podcast, it would have been a disservice to the content. But yeah, so there's some trial and error as we're getting things going for sure. Yep.
And how about any hints on what's next for you guys? 2020, we're recording this early in 2020. What are some things that are coming down the pipeline? Or maybe a better way to ask would be, what are some things you'd like to do? Some things, some ideas or things you guys would like to explore that maybe isn't on the agenda yet, but you'd like to see REI do?
Yeah, stuff coming down. There are going to be a couple of feature films coming out this year that we worked with folks on, I think, or helped invest in. And I think what's important to mention about those and what you'll see and really what's represented by the program is that those are not branded content projects. Those are not the types of things. REI is not present in the content. We're very intentional about that because we want to make sure that our presence doesn't dilute the message of the content. So I think that's what you'll see. And so excited about those coming out. And there will be more information when we're ready to release more information on those. But it also shows how we're evolving as an organization, and the idea of branded content, and our view being really a thing of the past, and it's not a thing of the past yet for a lot of people, but it will be, and that people are just looking for value and entertainment and education, and I don't think they care where that comes from, so long as it's sincere and in service of them and not in service of the brand. And that might be a step-by-step on how to file your taxes or how to purchase a trail run shoe, or it might be a feature-length film, whatever the case. And so I think we're really pushing on the boundaries of that and trying to just create value in different ways and ensure that people are seeing that value and seeing themselves and the things that we're creating.
Very cool. No, I love it. I think it's awesome. I think what you guys are doing is very exciting. You look at other major brands like GoPro and Red Bull, and they've created these massive media engines, and it kind of just from an outsider's perspective, it seems like you guys are starting to push in that direction, and I think it's very congruent with the brand. And I as a longtime REI fan, I love it. So keep doing what you guys are doing, and thank you for coming on the show. I think this was incredibly helpful, and I think everybody listening is going to take a lot out of it.
No, great. Thank you so much, Alan. Thanks for having me.
Hey crew, it's Alan Bird again. And real quick before you go, would you like a weekly digest of what's working today in the world of consumer-facing e-commerce? Every week, our team of strategists compile a single email with growth strategies and operations tactics that help you stay ahead of the curve and ahead of the competition. Think of it as the brand operator's cheat sheet. Just head over to thecommercelab.com to sign up.